All right, boys and girls, it is that time again. It is position rankings week here on the channel, starting off with offense and then doing defense next week. We have 5 episodes for each side of the ball, 5 on offense, wide receiver, tight end, running back, offensive line, which we're doing tackles and interior, all as kind of one large episode later in the week, and then finishing it off with quarterback. And then the following week, obviously, we're doing all of the defensive positions on Tuesday through Saturday of that week. And then right after that, we got the mock draft special coming out, which is going to be, well, if it all goes according to plan, it's going to be insane. You guys are going to love that. So we have a lot more coming your way. And while we're at it, if you want to head over to the podcast channel, the Bootleg Football Podcast that I run with my buddy EJ, he's coming down. We're getting a house over on the beach, kind of channeling our inner draft war room for the Rams. And we're doing a draft live stream once again, all 3 days of the draft. It's like 22 straight hours of content. Every single pick, no commercial breaks. I don't think you're going to get that anywhere else. So if you want to come hang out with us during literally the entire draft, as well as the pre-shows and the post-shows, head on over to the Bootleg Football Podcast channel and subscribe. Get the notifications to turn on for when we go live, or just follow me on Twitter, and I'll keep you updated there. But that being said, let's get back to position rankings. We have a lot to talk about today when it comes to wide receivers. We are doing this in a tier system, and I'll kind of explain as we go why I'm doing it that way, but that to me I think is the best way of organizing the insane depth at the position we have this year. So without further ado, let's get into tier 1 of my 2022 NFL Draft wide receiver rankings. All of the receivers that I have in tier 1 could go off the board in basically any order. It all just kind of depends on certain needs for certain teams, what kind of skill sets they want, etc., etc. It's really tough for me to kind of rank them definitively 1 through 5 in this tier because they all do different things well, and like I said, different teams are going to prioritize different aspects of their games. So don't really take this as a definitive order, just kind of look at it as a collection of similarly graded talents that could all go off the board at least around or near each other. First up, we have Jameson Williams from Alabama, who's a little bit different than all the other guys in this group because I do think that he might end up playing more Z receiver in the NFL compared to X receiver. Keep in mind that X receiver is typically going to be the position that is more on the line of scrimmage compared to lining up off the line of scrimmage like the Z or what most of the time the slot is going to be doing. And so it's more exposed to press coverage than the other receiver positions. And I do think that with Williams's frame, he's a lot skinnier, a lot lighter than a lot of the other guys, not just in this group, but in the class in general. So I do think he might end up playing more Z and kind of keeping him off the line of scrimmage, less exposed to press, kind of get him in motion more often so you can get him a little bit easier matchups against safeties or slower corners. He's going to be a guy that you have to game plan a little bit more in terms of getting him the right matchup. He's not like a lot of the other guys. But that being said, his speed is flat out game breaking. If I was a defensive coordinator, I would not feel comfortable leaving him on an island at all because he is literally a touchdown waiting to happen. He's got great deep ball tracking ability. He's a plus route runner. Maybe not as smooth or as efficient as, Devonta Smith or Jerry Jeudy, even Amari Cooper, kind of going back to Bama's receivers of years past. But he's still a pretty good route runner, and when you combine that with just his sheer explosiveness and speed and deep ball tracking ability, he is a threat to score on any given play. I do think that he should be used very similarly to how Tyreek Hill was used early in his career when he was kind of young in Kansas City and still trying to figure it out as a route runner, trying to figure out how to release versus press, because that was a problem with him early on as well. I think that Williams will be used in a similar way, where, again, it's a lot of motions, a lot of stuff from the slot, doing whatever they can to protect him from press while he learns, and hopefully while he puts on a little bit of weight, because I do think that he could stand to add some pounds as well. And then down the line, just like Tyreek did, I think as he develops his skill set, as he gets a little bit thicker and stronger and kind of hold up against contact, he can probably eventually be a full-time X receiver as well. Not guaranteed. I think his floor is a top-tier Z, a top-tier deep threat, maybe even a slot guy, but there is a chance that he could be a top-tier X, which if you're getting a top-tier X in the top, 15 to 20 picks of the draft, that is well worth it. I think he has a Pro Bowl ceiling, and hopefully he hits it. Hopefully the medical checks out, because when he's on the field, he is really, really exciting. Next up in this tier, we have Drake London, who the easy comparison to make is going to be like a Mike Evans or Brandon Marshall type. Evans is probably his most common comparison, and I'll be honest, it's hard to see anybody else when you watch him on tape. They look so similar in terms of frame, in terms of play style, in terms of kind of unnatural hip fluidity and footwork for a guy his size. You expect to see any receiver that's north of 6'3", 6'4", to have really stiff hips and not be able to, fire the feet and have really clean releases off the line, but he's really, really damn fluid. I think his basketball background shows up a lot in that area, and I think that when you look at his after the catch ability, like when they just kind of throw him screens or they throw him little routes to the flat and say turn up and go, his ability to kind of reset himself quickly, avoid tacklers, and just kind of find space, it really is unnatural for somebody with his frame. And so when I look at the size, the strength, the physicality, the ball skills, the fact that any 50-50 ball thrown his way in the red zone is really more like a 70-30 ball, and the fact that he's got yards after catch ability, he's a pretty underrated route runner. I mean, there's just very little not to like here. Obviously, the deep speed is not going to be anywhere near Jameson Williams, but he still does so much else really, really well that I don't necessarily think that matters. I think that his skill set is his skill set, and he does it phenomenally well. And I think that he's going to come into the league, God willing, his medical is okay. I know he's coming back from a pretty severe ankle injury, but if his medical checks out, he's going to come into the league and be a very productive receiver from day one. In terms of biases and where I want to see London go, I do think that he would be an excellent fit for the Jets at the 10th overall pick because of what Zach Wilson does as a quarterback. I think looking at Wilson's skill set, his deep ball ability, and specifically his deep ball placement outside the numbers, that works really well with what Drake London specializes in, again, as that kind of big, hulking jump ball receiver that could just go win at the catch point. I think they would work together very, very well and probably complement each other's skill sets better than most other combinations in this class. I know there's a lot of you out there that might be a little surprised that I think he could go in the top 10, but I mean, I've maintained this position since, January at this point, where I thought he could have been a top 5 pick, so top 10 technically is me even being lower on him than I was before, but I do think that he legitimately could be the first receiver taken. Were it not for a medical issue, I don't think that would be that unpopular of an opinion, but it is what it is. A lot of people in the NFL like him more than people in the media, and maybe even more than the fans do. He's got a lot of supporters around the league. So if he's the first receiver off the board, don't be shocked. If he's the 5th receiver off the board, also don't be shocked. But just know he's a really good player with a very dominant skill set, and wherever he does end up in the league, he's going to be pretty good. And that brings us to number 3, which is Garrett Wilson from Ohio State. And I know that there's been a little bit of a debate for a while, going back probably 2 years at this point, in terms of who the best receiver from Ohio State is out of that whole kind of crazy group they had. And for me, it is going to be Garrett Wilson. I know that Olave is also very good on his own, and I am not talking down on Olave at all, but I think that Wilson is just a more dynamic threat in a lot of different ways. I think that in terms of explosiveness and lateral agility, and even just route running, I think he's a more violent and almost creative route runner in a way. He reminds me a lot of Keenan Allen in terms of how he sets up DBs and just the borderline overwhelming agility, I guess is the way to put it, where like he does stuff laterally speaking. It's almost like teleportation. It's kind of crazy how shifty he is. And one of the only receivers that I think can do a lot of the things that he does is Keenan Allen, who's been one of the best receivers in the league since he stepped on the field. I know that Wilson is not the biggest guy, and he's not even the fastest guy, but I do think that he's the most sudden guy, which in a lot of ways is the most important thing. If you just need a guy that can, above all, get open and get open a lot, that's going to be Garrett Wilson. He's not going to post up people like London. He's not going to take the top off like Williams. He might not even have the same ceiling as Watson or Pickens or even some of the guys in tier 2, but in terms of high floor, like guys that I think that absolutely do not fail in the league, Wilson profiles like that kind of receiver. I know that I just said that London could go off the board at 10th overall and it would not faze me at all, and that is still true. I do think that there's a lot of people in the NFL that have London as the first receiver gone. But the reason why I put all of them in a tier and not a hard and fast order is because they could go off the board in any which way. And I think that there's a lot of people around the league that see the floor of Garrett Wilson as maybe not a can't miss prospect, but a very unlikely to miss prospect. and that could possibly elevate him above everybody else. So if he goes off the board first, it wouldn't shock me either. Either way, whoever does draft him is, in my opinion, getting another Keenan Allen, which, let's be honest, who could say no to that? And that brings us to number 4 in this tier, which is Christian Watson, and he's somebody who I've been very high on throughout the entire draft process. And at least for me, I've maintained pretty much since January that he's going to be a first-round pick. I realize that he's probably the most controversial receiver that I see most of draft media talking about. People either really love him or they're really not impressed by him at all, and there's really no middle ground between those two options, and I totally understand that. He is a very polarizing prospect. In terms of pure ceiling, he might have the best ceiling out of anybody in this tier because he's 6'4", about 210 pounds, legit 4.3 speed. Like, that's not just track speed, he runs 4.3 in pads. He's got an exceptional explosive profile when you look at the verts and the broads. His hips are incredibly fluid, his feet are great, and his route running acumen, that's the part that I think is most underrated. When you watch how he was abusing DBs down to the Senior Bowl, I mean, he's legitimately a great route runner. And I know you're listening to all this right now and saying, okay, Brett, then why doesn't everybody automatically love him because he's a giant, fast, explosive, polished receiver? What's wrong here? Why do people feel underwhelmed? And it's because there's some legitimate warts as well. For one, his drop rate is concerningly high. There were a lot of concentration drops on tape. His drop rate was almost 13%, which is not ideal, to put it mildly. And there were a lot of people that just said, okay, well then he's another Marquez Valdez-Scantling, which I think that's a little unfair. I think he's a much better player than MVS, and that's no disrespect to MVS. I just think that Watson is a more complete and polished player. But I do understand how people see a big, fast receiver with drop issues and just immediately think he's MVS. Again, I think he's better than that, but it is a fair criticism. And then number 2 that people look at is he just wasn't super productive, which is partly his own fault because some of those drops were for huge chunks of yardage where if he made those catches, his numbers would look a lot better. But it's also partly not his fault because he was in a run-first offense that if they had their way, they would have run the ball 40 times a week, regardless of the fact that they had Watson at receiver. So I think that there was a lot of games where he could have got more touches than he did, but they were just so committed to and so prolific at running the ball that they just didn't really throw his way unless they were trying to take a deep shot off play action or, if it was 3rd and long, they'd have him run a comeback. Sometimes they would try to scheme up touches for him in the run game with sweeps and end arounds and all that kind of stuff, but I think that he just wasn't a focus of the offense because of how they wanted to run their system. And that's not necessarily his fault, and I think that it could be a similar story to DK Metcalf, who also was kind of criticized for lack of production when he was coming out of college, and then he went to the NFL, where he went to an offense that knew how to use him and how to prioritize him, and all of a sudden he was having crazy numbers. So I do think that it's a little bit treacherous to use production against a guy like Watson, where it wasn't entirely his fault, but again, it's a fair criticism, and I at least understand where they're coming from. For me, in terms of how I value Watson, I just see what he did at the Senior Bowl, I see how he tested, and I just believe in the ceiling. I'm projecting him this high because it's what I think he could be in the league rather than what he is now. But if he does go to the right situation with all of the right pieces around him, which is a common argument you're going to hear this week, right situation, right quarterback, right coach, right time, I do think that he at least has the tools to be the best receiver from this class. Nobody else in this group has his combination of physical gifts with at least a baseline level of polish. So in a best case scenario where he maximizes that, he could be an all-pro. And with that, we're going to round out tier 1 with, at least to me, one of my favorite players in this class to watch, and that is George Pickens from Georgia. He didn't really play much in 2021 except for the last couple games, and even then he was not taking 100% of the snaps because he was still coming off that knee injury that he sustained this time last year. So I do think that there was kind of an out of sight, out of mind type thing, and he became a forgotten guy in this receiver class, even though he is exceptionally talented. And if you go back to the last couple of years before 2021, where you saw him, again, healthy and playing full-time snaps and going up against all these super talented SEC DBs and beating all of them, I think that's where you kind of see the potential that is George Pickens. He's got great vertical separation ability, and even though he did quote unquote only run in the mid to high 4.4s. I think that when you do watch his vertical routes down the boundary, those first few steps where you kind of clear the DB's hand and then stack on top, it's that initial burst of acceleration in order to get positioning vertically on the route. That's what he does exceptionally well. So it's not just the fact that he has 4.4 speed, it's the fact that he gets up to that 4.4 speed quickly, and then he can use that size and physicality to kind of establish that position and keep that position while the ball is in the air. It kind of reminds me a lot of AJ Green or DeAndre Hopkins, who even though they don't have the same speed of, say, Deshaun Jackson or Odell Beckham, the fact that they can get that position quickly in the route and then maintain that position, that is how vertical threats are made, and that is what George Pickens does extremely well. Throw in the fact that his ball skills are absolutely unreal, and so is his sideline awareness. It's pretty hard not to see those two types of receivers. Again, Green and Hopkins, who both have amazing ball skills and amazing toe tap ability on the boundary. Like, he's basically a clone of those two guys. I know he's kind of shaped more like AJ Green, but he does play like DeAndre Hopkins, and I mean, if you're getting even 80% of DeAndre Hopkins, you're getting a Pro Bowl receiver. So I do think that inevitably he is going to go in the first round, because guys that are that physical, that big, that fast, and most importantly, catch the ball that well, they're pretty hard to find. Obviously, his biggest obstacle to getting taken really high is going to be medical rechecks, because teams are going to want to go in there and look at that knee and see how he's healing and see if there's any red flags, I guess you could say, for future damage. But if the medical checks out, I kind of find it hard to believe that he's not going to be a first-round pick. You look at the Packers having multiple picks and needing a receiver. You look at the Chiefs having multiple picks and needing a receiver. Like, I don't know. I just don't really see a high possibility that he somehow gets out of those top 32 picks. There's too many teams that need his services, and I think his grade, at least on tape, matches up with a first-round quality receiver. It just makes too much sense to me. I would be genuinely shocked if he lasts longer than Thursday night. So that wraps up all of my Tier 1 receivers, which again, in no particular order, are Jameson Williams, Drake London, Garrett Wilson, Christian Watson, and of course George Pickens. And with that, let's get to Tier 2. My second tier of receivers is a whole lot of slot guys all grouped together. So I'm going to kind of talk about the first 5 in this tier as a group, because they all do a similar type of role, but they do it a little bit differently. Sky Moore, I think, does profile more as a slot receiver or a Z receiver, 2 roles that kind of keep him away from press corners and kind of keep him moving, giving him free releases. But I do think that because he has a little bit of a thicker build than a lot of the other guys, he could hold up against press coverage if you do want to put him at X for a little while. I think he could do that. He's not necessarily ideal for it, like, say, Drake London or even Garrett Wilson or obviously George Pickens, but he could do it. But I think when you look at his skill set, I mean, just phenomenal deep speed and deep ball tracking ability. He's a great route runner, catches everything, super tough over the middle. I would rather him be a slot receiver that you can also throw fades to from the slot than have him be a full-time X. I just think that he kind of sits there a little bit more comfortably than some of the other guys. But then when I look at Olave, I actually think that Olave might be less of a slot and more of a pure Z, or maybe even an X for some teams. Because if you're a team that likes to stick in 11 personnel all day, well, you need your slot receiver to be able to block, and he gives you nothing in the run game. So I think that for many teams out there that prioritize blocking for slot receivers, which, yes, there are those that exist, I do think that Olave might be a little bit lower on the board for them. So he might profile more as a pure outside guy for those types of teams. Now, that being said, again, because he is a little bit lighter, I think he's more of a Z than an X. If he was more of an X, I'd probably put him up in Tier 1, but he's not. So the fact that he's pretty much just a Z for many teams out there in terms of skill set means that he might go a little bit lower than we think. He's still a really good player, but the lack of alignment versatility, I guess is the word I'm going to use, that will knock him a little bit. He's got really good route running ability. He's silky smooth. He's got deep speed. He's got great hands. He's got all that kind of stuff. But it's the lack of size and physicality that does kind of limit where you can put him. So just kind of keep an eye on that. He might go lower as a result. On the other side of the spectrum, you got Calvin Austin, who's even smaller, and actually he's even smaller than Jahan Dotson too. Like, Dotson's tiny. He's 5'10", 178. Austin is 5'8", 170. So he is positively tiny. But that being said, I weirdly think that he could probably play X better than most of the other guys in this group, because even though he is so small, it's very much like Devonta Smith, where he's really slippery and really explosive off the line, where press corners can't really touch him anyway. And if a press corner can't get his hands on you, then he can't outmuscle you. So again, very similar to Devonta Smith, who was also rail thin at Bama, beating up all these corners in press that had 33-inch arms. I think the fact that he's really hard to touch kind of gives him advantage against a lot of bigger, longer, but also stiffer boundary corners, where he could probably be a pretty effective X. He'll probably play most of his snaps in the slot or at Z, just because, again, of what his size is, but I'm not really scared of putting him outside and then having a bigger slot receiver that, again, as we mentioned, teams want slot receivers that can block. If you want a big slot like Michael Pittman that can also, really throw a good crack block in the run game, you can do that with Pittman and then survive with Austin on the outside. So he might actually end up going a lot higher than you think, and maybe even higher than Olave and higher than Moore and higher than Dotson, because he's got a little bit more versatility in terms of where you can put him on the field. And that brings us to Jahan Dotson, who I just mentioned is also really, really small, but he's not necessarily as fluid or as explosive as Austin, so I do think he gets caught by press corners a little bit more often. So that does kind of put him in that Olave category of likely just a Z or maybe a pure slot. But since he also gives you absolutely nothing in the run game, there are going to be teams that move him down the board as well. So it just kind of depends on system. It depends on, what offense we're talking about and what they want their slot receivers to do. And that's going to determine how high Dotson and Olave and Moore and Austin all go. The one thing that Dotson can do really well is get vertical from the slot. And I think that, as teams kind of play more quarters defense and you're seeing safeties having to match up with slot receivers man-to-man down the field, he's the kind of guy that can punish that type of coverage. He's too good of a route runner and he's too damn explosive for most safeties to handle. So if you get quarters looks and he's in the slot, you can probably check to some kind of vertical concept and he's going to win and he's going to give you a big play. It's not unlike Deshaun Jackson, I think, when I kind of compare skill sets, where it's like he's there to do one job, which is operate from the slot and just get absolutely massive plays down the field. I think Deshaun Jackson's done that for a long time, and I think that Jahan Dotson can do that as well. So it just kind of depends on how valuable that is to you. It's obviously a more narrow skill set, but it's also a great skill set to have. So how high Dotson goes in the draft, I think, is going to be very intriguing because of that. And then to kind of round out this group of slot receivers that I have in Tier 2, lastly, we have Kyle Phillips, who is much different than a lot of the other guys in this group because he's a little bit bigger, he's much more physical, and I think he's more of like a, traditional slot, where he doesn't kind of give you the same downfield ability, but he's an absolutely phenomenal route runner. He is great at separating and separating early, and he's also very physical in the run game. I'm not saying that he's Cooper Kupp because he is not as big and he's not as fast as Kupp, but I do think that he provides that same kind of versatility and intensity and physicality, that kind of do-it-all slot receiver where you can really kind of give them any sort of assignment from play to play and have a reasonable expectation of success. It's not a narrow skill set, it's a very complete skill set, other than the fact that obviously he doesn't have the deep ball ability of Olave or Austin or Dotson or any of them, but for everything else that you want a slot receiver to do, Kyle Phillips can do it, and he can do it very, very well. If I had to make a true comp, because Cooper Kupp is not really a fair comp for him, I would say he's more in line with Hunter Renfrow, but maybe even quicker than Hunter Renfrow, which is saying a lot because Renfrow is a great player. If Phillips becomes even 90% of Renfrow or even 80% of Renfrow, he is well worth a second-round pick. I might be a little bit surprised if he does end up going that high in the real draft because there's a lot of big, tall, fast athletes that'll probably go ahead of him, but I at least expect him to go somewhere in the third. Minimum, he's going to go, again, anywhere in day 2, and he'll probably end up outproducing a lot of the guys that go ahead of him because he's so consistent, he's so polished, and he's just flat out a good football player, which in the end, good, versatile football players tend to play in the league for a long time. And speaking of those big, tall, fast receivers that will probably go ahead of Phillips, but maybe not outproduce Phillips, let's talk about Treylon Burks. And this one's going to be a little bit controversial because most people, I would say, have him in quote-unquote their tier 1 of receivers, somewhere in their top 5 to 6 guys. I personally do not. But that being said, if you told me that Treylon Burks was the first receiver taken, I would say that I totally believe you, just based off his film. And if you also told me that he was the 8th receiver taken, I would also totally believe you, also based off his film and everything that's happened since the college season ended. I have no idea where he's going to go. I have no idea how high he's going to go. But even I can admit, just looking at him on tape from 6 or 7 months ago, I get why people are excited. The ball skills were fantastic. His speed was ridiculous for his listed size. I mean, he was outrunning the entire Bama defense, which says a lot. Route running was far from polished, I'll say that. It was pretty raw in my opinion, but just seeing what he could do with the ball in his hands, it reminded me a lot of, like a young Cordell Patterson, but even more refined than Patterson was when he was coming out of school. So again, I see why people were excited. You look at the athleticism, you look at the ball skills, you look at the potential of what he could be in, say, the quote-unquote Debo role, hybrid receiver, hybrid running back. I get it. But because of how raw he is as a route runner, how raw he is as a football player in general compared to every other receiver in the top 2 tiers, I do think that his success or failure is going to be determined heavily by what coaching staff he goes to and, what kind of system he goes to and how they plan to use him. I also think that he's going to need to stay in shape because there were, I guess rumors is the right word to use, but well-substantiated rumors that he was out of shape in the pre-combine training process by a pretty fair bit, I'll just say that, which could probably explain why some of the testing was disappointing compared to what he showed on film. And that, I think, is something that teams are going to have to ask him about, and they're going to have to see if they feel comfortable with his answers, depending on how he answers those questions. Again, I don't have a reason why the conditioning was an issue. I'm not even going to try to speculate on it. All I know is that it was. And so that's something that teams are going to have to ask him about, and he's going to have to answer it, and we'll see what happens. I truly don't know what the story was behind that. I just know it happened. So that might drop him. It might not matter at all. We'll see. But when you factor in that with the fact that, again, raw route runner, kind of a project, I would say, as a receiver, even though he has unbelievable potential. I mean, he has the potential to be one of the best weapons in this entire class. It's just a little bit of a risky profile that I personally, as somebody who does not work for a team, I don't have enough information to feel good about it. I totally understand that he can enter the league and maybe he has 0 issues and he goes on to be an all-pro caliber receiver. I get it, but I personally at this time, I just don't have enough information. So I have him down here kind of late, quote-unquote, in tier 2, and we'll just see what happens. And then to round out my second tier, I've got somebody who I really struggled with this, but I just couldn't leave him out, and that was Bo Melton from Rutgers. He has an extremely high ceiling and could very well end up being a better pro receiver than a lot of the guys that go ahead of him. He's got legit 4.3 speed. I'm talking easy acceleration off the line. Like that huge vertical, which I think was 38 inches, that shows up on tape. He gets to top speed really quickly. He's kind of spastic, but also really slippery as a route runner. And if you watched any of his Senior Bowl film, I mean, he was a really tough guy to cover in the one-on-ones. He's just very, very slippery. He was demolishing people that entire week because of that lateral agility, because of that creativity. He's just kind of fun to watch in that area. Now, unfortunately, production was obviously mediocre, but it wasn't really his fault. He did play in a horrific offense at Rutgers that couldn't pass protect. They couldn't really throw much down the field. Quarterback was obviously an issue. But what I want people to understand is he didn't have to be at Rutgers, but he chose to be at Rutgers. He was a 4-star prospect coming out of high school with offers from everywhere from Michigan to Ohio State to Penn State, Oregon, Pitt. I mean, he could have gone anywhere, but he decided to play at Rutgers because that's where his parents went to school and they were both athletes at Rutgers. And unfortunately for him, the school was just kind of in a complete rebuild mode while he was there, so there was not a whole lot of talent around him. I do think that he can play all over the field at X or Z or in the slot. He can return kicks and punts. He can be involved in the run game on those sweeps as well. He's a really, really versatile player, exceptionally talented. He showed up well at the Combine. He showed up well at Senior Bowl. he checks a lot of different boxes. Now, he doesn't quite have the same ball skills of, say, Treylon Burks or Sky Moore in terms of making crazy catches down the boundary or in the red zone, and he's not nearly as physical as Phillips as a blocker, but he still does bring a ton to the table as a deep threat and a possession receiver, and even somebody who can carry the ball for you a little bit as well. So, at least in my opinion, he should still be a day 2 pick at some point. Just like everybody else in this tier, it's really tough for me to nail down exactly how high he's going to go, and it's possible that I'm just way higher on him than teams are in the league. But that being said, I have a lot of confidence just looking at his skill set as a separator and as a deep threat that wherever he does end up, regardless of how high he gets drafted, he's going to make a roster and he's going to stick on a roster for a very long time. All right, so that is tier 1 and tier 2. Most of those guys are probably the stars that you've heard of. And tier 3 and tier 4, at least on my rankings, are full of guys that maybe some of you haven't heard of. Or if you listen to the podcast, you probably heard of most of them by now because we've been talking glowingly about many of them for months at this point. But just in case you only follow this channel and you don't follow the podcast and you have not heard some of the names I'm about to talk about, this class is very, very deep, and some of these tier 3 and tier 4 guys will be on rosters, and they will be in the league for a very long time because, quite frankly, there's a lot of crazy athletes in this class. But before I get to talking about all of them and why I have them where I do in my rankings, I do want to take one moment to thank our sponsor for today that helped to make really this entire week's slate of shows possible, Hawthorne. Hawthorne is a premium tailored men's grooming brand that is all about matching men to the ideal products for their own body chemistry and lifestyle. All you have to do is take a quick quiz online at Hawthorne's website where they ask you a whole lot of questions about your type of hair, your type of skin, and of course your preferences for fragrance or your favorite drink, and they'll come up with a personalized list of products that fits your needs. From there, you can pick whatever products you want and whichever ones you don't want. You can get basically anything you'll ever need that are formulated specifically for men, like face cleanser, lotions, body wash, deodorants, and even some, in my opinion, really nice colognes as well. They kind of do have a little bit of everything, just depending on whatever your needs are. And Hawthorne takes all of the risk out of it as well because you get free shipping on your order and on any returns. And if you don't even like your products, they'll even retailer them for you based on your feedback, also free of cost. If you guys take the quiz below and you see something in their catalog that you want, you can use my promo code FILMROOM10 to get 10% off your first order. Again, that is promo code FILMROOM10 for a discount on anything at hawthorne.co on your first order. They are really great products that fill a variety of needs for men specifically, and I've used them for a really long time at this point because of how they make my skin feel, because of how they make my hair feel, and because of how they make me smell. They all smell really, really good too. So I highly recommend them. I think you guys are going to like them a lot as well. Again, check that link out in the description. Thank you again to Hawthorne for sponsoring today's show. And with that being said, let's get to tier 3. When looking at all the names that I have in my tier 3, I like to label it as the deep threats and gadgets group because that is predominantly what it's made up of. In terms of pure deep threats, we have Alec Pierce from Cincinnati, we have Romeo Doubs from Nevada, Tyquan Thornton from Baylor, who is legit 4.2 speed, like that dude can fly. Wan'Dale Robinson kind of fits in either category because he could be a deep threat, he could be a gadget, but because of his size, I kind of lump him in more with the, strict slot / gadget type guys. And then you got Velus Jones Jr., who is a transfer from USC to Tennessee, and you've got Khalil Shakir from Boise State, who both I think are really at home as kind of those slot / gadget types. And I think that as number 3 receivers in those roles, they can both be really successful as well. The one outlier here is going to be Jalen Tolbert, who to me is kind of like a Kirkland brand Corey Davis. Like he could play X, he could play Z. If you want to make him a big slot, he could do that as well. And he doesn't really overwhelm you with any particular trait. Like he's got enough speed, enough size, enough physicality, really good ball skills, but doesn't necessarily blow you away with, yards after catch ability like Velus Jones. He doesn't immediately take the top off a defense like Alec Pierce or Romeo Doubs or Tyquan Thornton. He's not particularly shifty like Khalil Shakir, and I don't think that he's even nearly as shifty as Wan'Dale Robinson either. So he is kind of like a jack of all trades, master of none type guy Again, very similar to like a Corey Davis or a Mohamed Sanu, just a very solid possession receiver. In terms of which one of these guys I think is going to go off the board first, I would probably say Alec Pierce from Cincinnati, just because looking at his physical profile, he is a massive frame with legit 4.41 speed, and he gets up to that speed immediately. If I remember correctly, he had about a 40.5-inch vert, and that really does show up in his acceleration. Like, he can really stack on a DB in the first 3 to 4 steps. And if I was a defensive coordinator, I wouldn't really feel comfortable leaving him one-on-one on an island because of that speed and because of that explosiveness. Not to mention, again, he does have the size and the frame, so if he was going to play down in the slot, I think he could outmuscle a lot of nickel DBs that tend to be a lot shorter and smaller. So he's just kind of a hard problem for a defense to solve. I don't necessarily think he's quite refined enough right now to be a true number one, but I do think he has the physical talent to possibly get there eventually. And best case scenario, I know this sounds crazy, but best case scenario, he does kind of match up skill set wise with DK Metcalf. And remember, DK went all the way at like pick 64, so I do think that Pierce could go somewhere in that range as well. And if he does go to the right spot that I think can develop him, he could potentially have that same kind of Metcalf sort of impact. The other 3 guys that I also really want to highlight in this tier are Khalil Shakir, who is dynamic with the ball in his hands. Really, really fun player to watch. I do think he is oddly faster with the ball in his hands than fast in his routes, which is kind of odd, but there's just something about when he has the rock, he does kind of hit that extra gear, and he's really tough to handle in space. He just becomes a completely different player. So I kind of want to see him used in, he's not Deebo Samuel, but in that kind of Deebo Samuel-ish role where, you know, he gets some snaps at running back, you put him on returns, you give him a lot of screens, and also he can do some damage over the middle on third downs too, but just kind of the difference in how he plays with the ball versus without the ball, I just kind of want that to be explored and have him be used more as like a slot/gadget type guy. In that same realm, we have Velus Jones, who is even more dynamic and even more explosive than Khalil Shakir, so he very well could go earlier, but I also think he's a little bit more raw as a route runner than Shakir, so it just kind of depends on the preference of the teams and how they grade those types of things, and also, of course, the role that they're looking to fill. I think that he does give you a little bit more dynamism as a returner because he is a complete freak athlete. So for teams that are looking for somebody that can return the ball and also get snaps in the backfield and be a slot receiver and a deep threat, and somebody that, you know, if it's 3rd and 5 and they just get a look where they want to give the ball to somebody in space, he's somebody who I think can potentially pay that off. Plus, as he gets older and as he gets more refined as a route runner, you know, potentially he could be more than just a returner/gadget guy. But for now, at least in that role, I think he's really good. And then, of course, I couldn't do this tier without talking about Romeo Doubs from Nevada, who is super underrated. And unfortunately, because of some injury issues, I don't necessarily think he's been able to be highlighted as much in the pre-draft process as he should be. But he is a legit deep threat. Like, I think that he can take off the top of a defense just as well as, say, Jahan Dotson or Chris Olave or really most of the guys from tier 2, but I do think some durability concerns or even just, you know, lack of medical information on my end, that's kind of what pushed him down to group 3 for me because I just don't really know what his medicals look like right now. But at least on tape, he is a really fun player. For teams that are looking for a complementary receiver with legit deep speed that can take the top off a defense and kind of pay off those one-on-one opportunities, Doubs is going to be a fantastic value for them somewhere late day 2, early day 3, again, depending on how the medicals check out. And again, if he goes to the right spot with the right kind of quarterback, cough, cough, Buffalo, that knows how to pay off that skill set, he can be super productive in the NFL. Also, by the way, one more note. It's not just Buffalo. He could also go to Kansas City sometime on day 2 and be a natural fit there, especially since they are desperate for receivers with that skill set right now. So just kind of keep an eye out. I do think he's got a pretty good chance of being a top 100 pick. In terms of Tyquan Thornton, you probably heard his name a lot kind of, you know, late January going into February because he absolutely crushed Shrine Bowl week and he had a really good combine as well. Just put up some really freaky numbers. In terms of skill set and role and who I would compare him to in that standpoint, he does remind me a lot of like a Darius Slayton, but with less meat on the bones. You know, somebody who can be that number 2, number 3 complementary deep threat, likely kind of sticking at Z the entire time so that you don't have to have him deal with press coverage, because again, he is pretty rail thin, and I don't necessarily think he is as quick or slippery to get out of press like how I mentioned Calvin Austin does and Devonta Smith does. So he is kind of locked into that Z role, in my opinion, very similar to Chris Olave and Jahan Dotson, but he's just not quite as prolific as those two, so I had to put him down in tier 3. He could still be a very, very effective deep threat, and I think that he's going to be a value somewhere late day 2, early day 3, and if he goes to the right spot, again, with a quarterback that has a huge arm that can pay off that speed, he can be a good contributor and probably surprisingly productive early on. So again, kind of recapping tier 3 here, we have the true deep threats with Alec Pierce, Romeo Doubs, Tyquan Thornton, and sort of to a degree Jalen Tolbert and Wan'Dale Robinson, but less so. And then we have the true gadget players like Khalil Shakir, Velus Jones, and again, Wan'Dale Robinson. Just a complete mishmash of different skill sets here that, at least to me, in terms of total grade, are very close together. And with that, that brings us to tier 4, which I have dubbed Lotto Tickets and Glue Guys. These are John Mechie, Justin Ross, David Bell, Tanner Connor, Isaiah Weston, Josh Johnson, and Jalen Naylor. In terms of glue guys and how I define that, it's going to be your less physically overwhelming and kind of more reliant on polish and good hands and toughness and all of those other intangibles to be the glue guy of your receiving core. You know, the number 4, the, potentially number 3 guy who is not really flashy at any particular thing, but he can come in, he can get 3 or 4 catches, he can convert some first downs for you. You're never going to complain when he's on the field, but he also just doesn't really have the dynamic ceiling of all the other guys in the tiers above him. And then the lotto tickets are the guys who do have those insane traits, but are either super raw or they played in a really lower level of football, so to speak, so we haven't seen a whole lot of them against top competition. That's going to be, Tanner Connor, who's an absolutely freak athlete. He worked out up at UW's Pro Day up in Seattle because he's a local product up there, and we're talking, 6'3", 225, 4'3 speed. He's an ex-track guy. He did hurdles in high school, so he's got a monster vert of 39.5. And that speed and athleticism really does show up on tape. He was absolutely demolishing D1 corners over at Shrine Bowl week. So shout out to Eric Galco for somehow finding him all the way at Idaho State. He really is a diamond in the rough. But again, because there's very little tape on him against top quality competition, he's probably going to slip pretty far. But the athlete is very intriguing. Same kind of story for Isaiah Weston. Huge frame, super explosive, great deep speed. When you look at RAS or relative athletic score, he's one of the most athletic receivers, not just in this class, but in any class. But he did play at a lower level of football, so it's tough to know exactly how high he's going to go. But I guarantee you there's a lot of receiver coaches out there, they're going to look at the frame and look at the athleticism and say, I can do something with that. So at minimum, he will be drafted. I just don't quite know where. And then Josh Johnson from Tulsa, I think he's a really fascinating lotto ticket. Kind of profiles more like a slot receiver to me because he's really, really quick. Lateral agility is off the charts, and he's a very polished route runner as well. His release package is super fun, really diverse. Leave him one-on-one on third down at your own peril. He's very hard to handle. But like I said, I do think that he is going to go lower than a lot of the other slot receivers that are above him in tier 2 and tier 3 because he doesn't quite bring the same dynamism as, say, Velus Jones or Khalil Shakir with the ball in his hands. He doesn't have quite the same amount of tape against top competition as, say, Bo Melton or, Kyle Phillips, Jahan Dotson, Olave, all those other guys in tier 2. So even though I do think he's really talented, he's a really good route runner, lateral agility is fantastic, I do think that there are certain things that will push him down the board a little bit. I think that he could very easily outperform his draft status, but just realistically speaking here, he's going to be one of the last slot receivers taken. Now, Jalen Naylor, on the other hand, is somebody who did play in a top conference. He played against a lot of competition. I think he put up some really good testing numbers. And the tape is pretty fun, too. I think he's a really nice lotto ticket as a deep threat. but he doesn't really bring the same size as a lot of the other deep threats in this class. So if you're going to draft speed, you might as well draft somebody who I think can also bring that physicality to it, like, say, Alec Pierce, and to a degree, Romeo Doubs and Jalen Tolbert. So I think he might go after those guys for that reason. But again, really fun player, kind of a complimentary wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 type deep threat. He'll probably end up making a roster and sticking around for quite a while just for that. But if he hits, he's Robbie Anderson, and Robbie Anderson's a pretty solid player. So I think that's a pretty decent comp and, hope for trajectory for him. And now let's round it out with the 3 guys who I think, probably have got hurt the most from this pre-draft process. And that's going to be John Mechie from Bama, Justin Ross from Clemson, and David Bell from Purdue. Mechie, I think his injury really, really hurts him because I think he desperately needed to time well. And because he's still coming off that knee, he's not going to get to really time or do any sort of athletic testing at all. So I think that that's going to be rough for him because my biggest concern with him was speed. I just didn't really see speed and explosiveness like I'm used to seeing from Alabama receivers. I think he was clearly, out of all the guys that's getting drafted from that program in the last several years, I think he's probably the slowest one. Like, I kind of saw low to mid 4.5 on tape. And he is a really good route runner. He's really tough. He's got great hands, all that kind of stuff that you hope to see from a glue guy. I just didn't really see the same dynamism that I saw from a lot of the receivers that I have ranked higher. So it's unfortunate that we didn't get to see him test because I just wanted to see what he would run. And, maybe if he hit mid to high 4.4, I would go back and, kind of give it another chance and just see if I was missing something. But I really don't think I was. I do think that he's kind of like a low to mid 4.5 type guy, which is fine. You can still make it in the NFL at that speed, but I don't know. I don't really see it. And then, kind of similar story for Justin Ross. I think he's good at what he does. He's a very good route runner. I think he's got great hands. I think he's a, established red zone threat, but just not vertically explosive, not fast. He is, the typical big slot glue guy. If it's 3rd and 6, he's going to box out nickel DBs and, use his frame and leverage, and you can convert first downs with him. I just don't really see how he's going to rip off a whole bunch of chunk yards. That's not really his game. And for somebody like him that profiles like him, bigger body, slower, less explosive, but great hands, he's going to be a big slot that goes somewhere on day 3. And that's nothing against him. I think there's value to that type of guy. We call them glue guys for a reason. He's going to stick on a roster for that reason. But I don't really see the whole, Justin Ross top 10, top 15 receiver talk. Personally, I don't have him graded that way. And then similar kind of story for David Bell, who, we were hoping collectively kind of in the draft community that he was going to test better than what he looked on tape. I was hoping that I was wrong and that he was slow, but nah, he's slow. And again, great hands, great route runner, super physical, really good at tracking the ball in the air. He's got a lot of things on his resume that he does really well, but he's just not explosive. So I see him, again, wide receiver 4-ish, maybe wide receiver 3 on the right team if they're going to accentuate what he does really well. You can put him as a big slot, I guess, if you don't really want to have like a vertical element out of your slot receiver, because he is tough. I think he can block a little bit. And again, he's a really good route runner, but it's a very limited role, I think, for David Bell. He can absolutely work in the league, but he's got to be in the right spot, on the right team, and kind of using what he does well in order to be successful. I don't necessarily think he's dynamic enough to, be an everything type receiver like maybe some people were hoping for during the season. He's just not that guy to me. So just kind of looking at tier 4 in totality, again, you've got those glue guys that not particularly physically talented, but they catch everything thrown their way, and they're going to be a good presence in the locker room. That's Mechie, Ross, and Bell. And to a degree, Josh Johnson, but I think he's more physically talented than the other guys. He just didn't play in the same kind of conference as them. And then you've got the lotto tickets, the guys who do have a lot of talent that potentially could far exceed their draft status. And that is Tanner Conner, Isaiah Weston, and Jalen Naylor. I am almost certain that all of these guys will be drafted at some point on day 3. I just have no idea what order they'll be drafted in. That's why I put them all in the same tier. It just kind of depends on, what skill sets are being valued by certain teams, what kind of roles they're looking for in terms of what they want to fill in their receiving core. It's really hard for me to kind of predict that for all 32 teams, so I'm not even going to try. All I know is my total grade for all of these guys stacked up pretty similarly, and I do think that all of them will likely be day 3 picks. All right, so that'll about wrap it up for today. That was tier 1 through tier 4 of my wide receiver rankings. Obviously, this is not every receiver that will get drafted or kind of become a star UDFA, however you want to put it. There's going to be a lot more than this that end up playing in the league, most likely. But I can't really talk about all of them in one video because this would never end. So I kind of cut it off at the first 20 to 25 names. If you want to hear my thoughts on several of the other late round gems that will likely, or at least possibly, get drafted, remember you can go over to the podcast channel, the Bootleg Football Podcast. Subscribe there. We've talked about a lot of them over there, and we're going to be hitting on a lot of them as they get drafted in our draft live stream for all 3 days of the draft. So if you're interested in hanging out with us during basically the entire draft weekend, go subscribe over there, turn on notifications, all that kind of stuff. Thank you again to Hawthorne for sponsoring today's show. Go support them and help support the channel while you do it. And with that being said, we'll be back tomorrow with tight ends. It's a very deep tight end class, so there's a lot of names to go over there. Same time tomorrow, same place. See you then.